William Marvin Dulaney. I'm from Alliance, Ohio, born in Troy, Alabama. My parents were, my mother was a domestic. My father worked in the steel mill. As I said, we were originally from Alabama. We moved from Alabama during the Second Great Migration in 1951 to Alliance, Ohio, primarily because of my uncle, and that's another story that I won't go into. But I went to schools in Ohio, graduated from high school in 1968, so you see how old I am, and went to Central State University, which is an HBCU in Wilberforce, Ohio. Graduated in 1972. Went to Ohio State University for my master's and my PhD. All of my degrees are in history, and specifically African American history. I've been in education basically all of my career. That is, I've been an assistant professor, associate professor, and department chair at two universities, the College of Charleston, the University of Texas at Arlington. I've been working here at the African American Museums as a volunteer since '86. I left in '94, came back in 2008. I was became full-time in February 2020 and served full-time as Deputy Director and Chief Operations Officer here at the museum for 2 years. So I'm actually back again as a volunteer. I still have the title of Deputy Director and Chief Operations Officer, and I come in 3 days a week, work primarily in planning programs, working here in the library and the archive. We have a full range of archives behind this wall. It would shock you to see it. We've actually cleaned it up because when I started working in the archives here in 2017 after I retired from UTA, we had stuff on the floor and it was a mess. But we've cleaned it up pretty good, and again, that's primarily what I try to do here as Deputy Director and Chief Operations Officers, to do intake for archival collections, get them processed and get them ready so that people can use them. One of the collections that we got, for example, actually two that I highlight, we have the A. Maceo Smith collection. And of course, A. Maceo Smith was very prominent here in terms of the civil rights movement, community development for African Americans. He was executive director, executive secretary of the Dallas Negro Chamber of Commerce when he first came here in 1932, and he sort of served in that role for about 10 years. We also have the Sepia magazine collection. Sepia was published in Fort Worth. It was a black magazine that started in 1945, and it was what we call the poor man's ebony, meaning all of the photographs are in black and white, versus ebony, we got a full color spread. And so we have that collection, some 20,000 photographs, as a matter of fact, mainly entertainers and politicians, and sort of spreads on black life in terms of politics, social affairs, poverty, religion, you name it. And so the Sepia magazine collection is one of our best collections, and we're in the process of trying to digitize it versus just having a bunch of photographs sitting on the shelf. So that's basically me. I'm an educator, historian. I've published and edited and published 4 books, and I mentioned to you I'm working on a book about African Americans in Dallas, primarily because there is no comprehensive history of African Americans in Dallas, and as a result, we get books like The Accommodation that I think you're probably familiar with, that is just full of errors and doesn't address what really happened in terms of civil rights here in the city of Dallas. So my book will correct the record and tell the full story. Yeah, I met Mr. Butts mid-'80s, and I met him when he was in the process of donating his photograph collection to the Dallas Public Library. and we helped him, or he did an exhibition on Black life in Dallas. We actually have about 4 or 5 of the panels back in the archives when he did that exhibition, using some of his photographs, looking at Black life in the late 40s, because that's basically when he started working with the Dallas Express. And so his photographs date from the late 40s, and then of course come forward. Then when I was at UTA, when I came back, they gave me some money to come back, okay? Not just a salary, but money to do projects here in the community. So I was able to get one of my graduate students to go to the Dallas Public Library on a regular basis and actually do the processing of the Marion Butts collection. So I actually got, a file of what's in the Marion Butts collection based on what my former student did in terms of processing that collection in in 2009, 2010. So very familiar with his work. I used one of his photographs in my presentations on civil rights in Dallas. It's a photograph that he did in 1947 at the State Fair, where it says, "Hit the trigger and dunk the end." Okay, and so I always use that photograph to say to people in Dallas who believe, like the accommodation says, there was no civil rights movement in Dallas, and there was no need for a civil rights movement in Dallas. And I use that as an example of sort of the attitude among many whites here in the city in the 40s and 50s about civil rights and about African Americans. Dr. King visited Dallas three times. He actually came in '57 when he was organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to recruit some of the ministers here and of course to raise funds. He came again in '62 for a poll tax campaign rally. There's a picture of him, I guess it's in the Marion Butts collection, of him with Reverend E.C. Estelle at the airport and also at, I guess it's the YMCA, okay. Then in '66, he came, in the interim, by the way, in '64, because I got the letters, in '64, SMU invited him here, but they had to rescind and tell him not to come because the local community thought that he would be too controversial and stir up things, and so they told him not to come. And again, I actually have those letters from the student government president at SMU to Dr. King. And then of course he comes in '66 and he does the speech, and that speech is actually available online that he did at SMU in 1966. Starting in 1907, the city council passes segregation ordinances for everything: housing, public transportation, so on, employment across the board, and public facilities and so on. In 1916, the city council passes a ordinance that says that African Americans and whites cannot live in the same block in the city. So fortunately, that ordinance is overturned in a national case that the NAACP files in Louisville, Kentucky, because Louisville, Kentucky had done something similar in terms of passing an ordinance saying that blacks and whites cannot live in the same community. The Supreme Court strikes down both of those ordinances in 1970. And so then the city of Dallas has to find, as well as other cities across the country, not just in the South, they have to find ways then to separate, keep blacks out of white neighborhoods. So indeed, they come up with redlining, and basically the redlining is able to use redlining, of course, using the banks, the federal government, do the redlining, and so they're able to enforce it and have it stand by restrictive covenants. You understand those? Yes, no. Well, with restrictive covenants, the deed that you use to buy your house, they basically put in there that you cannot sell the house to a Negro, a Mexican, and no one who is not of the white race. Okay, so that's how they're sort of able to enforce the redlining, by indeed using restrictive covenants. And basically, the Civil Rights Acts, specifically the Civil Rights Act of '66 and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, basically restricts the states from discriminating against African Americans, even though they'll eventually allow the states to do it. But the argument is that individuals can discriminate against whomever they want. You know, if I have a business and I don't want you in it, I can keep you out. And so then with restrictive covenants, that's like a contract. And so the federal government, the state of Texas, can't get involved in these contracts between individuals. If the individual wants to tell the person that he's selling the house to that he can't sell it to anybody but a member of the white race, that's fine, particularly if the other person signs it and agrees to it. So those stand all the way up until a case called Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. So basically from 1916, 1917, after they strike down this, the Supreme Court strikes down this case in 1917, this is what is primarily used to keep blacks out of white neighborhoods, keep Mexicans out of white neighborhoods. So what happens then is it creates a crisis and a problem for African Americans because nobody's building homes for African Americans, and it's not a bad problem, but it is a problem. So when the Depression occurs, starting 1929 through the 30s, one of the things that occurs is that African Americans and Mexican Americans come from the rural areas of Texas to Dallas. They come from Louisiana, they come from Oklahoma, and create this housing problem because there's no housing being built for African Americans in the city of Dallas. And so they set up shanties, down on the Trinity River. And the newspaper said, and I can't even envision this, said that there are 60,000 people living in shanties on the Trinity River. I can't envision that because the Trinity River there's not enough space for that number. So I think they were exaggerating that number but basically all these people who came to Dallas with no housing literally set up shop, using cardboard boxes and tin foil and everything to build shelters on the Trinity River. So one of the issues that A.B.C.O. Smith has to address with the Chamber of Commerce and through this other little organization called the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance is housing and poverty among African Americans in Dallas, plus education. They built Booker T. Washington in 1922, one high school for African Americans, but by the 30s, there's 1,600 students going to a facility for 600. And so they have to have the students attend school in shifts. There's 3 shifts daily. And none of the students get the required, I guess it's 6 hours of schooling that they're supposed to get daily. So this indeed is where the civil rights movement sort of starts in Dallas. This is the story that the accommodation misses completely. And indeed, this is what causes the bombing of the homes in 1940 and 41 in Dallas, in South Dallas, the first time around. So, A.B.C.O. Smith, Maynard Jackson, Juanita Craft, they began to organize they organized the Progressive Voters League in 1936, and they are able to affect the election of the city council election of 1937, and they get a group of people, sort of like a political association called the Ford Dallas Association, that agrees then to meet their demands. more housing for African Americans, another high school for African Americans, blacks on the police department, and city jobs. And indeed, they get all of those things except the police on blacks on the police force. They get new housing project. Just north of us is Roseland Homes. Then they also get two other projects in the early 40s, but Roseland Homes is the first one. They get a new high school, Lincoln High School, right down, not too far from where we are, which relieves then the pressure on Booker T. Washington. Now, Roseland Homes was supposed to also address the housing problem, but because of Lincoln High School, African Americans start moving from the area south of that area up into South Dallas. That's what causes the problem then in 40 and 41, where whites bomb about 20 homes, and of course the city then makes those African Americans move out of those houses and pays them to go elsewhere. So housing and redlining, literally continues to exist, even though the city had built and put together Roseland Homes as a place to relieve this housing pressure for African Americans. It happens again, as you know, in 50 and 51, where they bombed 10 homes, and then of course they come up with Hamilton Park. But the redlining still continues, and basically South Dallas, as you know, begins to shift starting in the 50s. And by 57, I actually got a newspaper article that says South Dallas has become majority black. And so then they redline South Dallas, to basically not invest in homes and supermarkets and the things that people normally need to live in a community. And so the redlining basically starts in 1907 and it goes all the way, in spite of the Supreme Court case in 1948 that outlaws redlining and also outlaws restrictive covenants. So of course one of the great stories I always tell when I talk about housing is about the Dallas fullback, what's his name, in 1967, couldn't find an apartment in Dallas because because of housing discrimination continuing. What is his name? It'll come to me. But anyway, there's a newspaper there's a story in the newspaper, the Dallas Express, about how a Dallas Cowboys fullback can't find an apartment because of housing discrimination, that they don't allow African Americans, no matter who they are, to rent apartments in white areas. And now, of course, his thing was, I shouldn't have to rent some of these terrible apartments in the black neighborhoods. I want to rent one of those nice ones, up north, Highland Park, and so on. So anyway, his name will come to me because there's a picture of him with the article in the Dallas Express. They begin finding territories to do the annual Texas State Fair, and this becomes the area. And of course, over time, it expands. As the fair gets bigger, they of course attempt to get more land from the surrounding community. And of course, they really push it after the neighborhood changes, as I said, in 1957. Then in the 60s, as you know, that's when Peter Johnson decides to protest, then buy up the homes from African Americans from less than market price in order to create parking for Fair Park. Well, as you know, this was a Jewish neighborhood at first, okay? There's the remnants or the remains of a synagogue straight down the street. This sort of the South Boulevard Park Row area is a historic area, because that was sort of the center of the Jewish community that existed here before African Americans came. In the 70s, Al Roberts. Of course, he put together a movement to make it a historic district, and they put that marker right there at Atlanta and South Boulevard to sort of commemorate and acknowledge that one, it was a Jewish neighborhood, but African Americans moved in and decided that we're going to keep this neighborhood, at the level that it's supposed to be, rather than, it's sort of interesting when you go through South Dallas that it changes once you get below Martin Luther King, okay? Because north of right there, Atlanta and Martin Luther King, the neighbor north of that is really nice, historic district. Then south of it, it becomes, I don't know what to call it. Personal story. When I first moved to Dallas in 1981, I didn't know where I was in terms of moving into a neighborhood. So a friend of mine, who's actually from my hometown, he's asked me where I was living. I said, I live in South Dallas. Just for acknowledging where I live, South Dallas. So he said, what street you live on? And so I told him the street, which is Matagorda, about a block from Redbird Lane. And he says, that's not South Dallas, fool. That's South Oak Cliff. So, but my thought was, I thought I was in South Dallas because I didn't know any better. Then, of course, D Magazine did a special issue in 1981-82 about South Dallas and talked about how, how the city, you could see downtown from South Dallas, but when you get over here, it's like you're in another world because of the poverty, because of the decrepit housing, the economic deprivation, and it's just mind-blowing. When I saw it, I actually kept that issue of D Magazine, and I remember I did a presentation maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I pulled that cover, as sort of the centerpiece for the presentation on South Dallas. The mayor was there, and he got upset with me because I was pointing out all the deprivation and all the poverty and the discrepancies between North Dallas and South Dallas, the lack of investment, the fact that from one zip code to another, that it increased your chances of having cancer, you increase your chances of being in poverty, and basically that South Dallas had been this sort of neglected area of the city, again, primarily because of the redlining that was sort of still taking place. Yeah, and so the mayor got a little upset with me, so he gets up behind me and says, well, we're doing all we can, to improve living in South Dallas. Okay. I've been coming here ever since we built the building in '93. So I've been coming here, and I thought nothing of it. So then, hearing about how bad South Dallas is and how people don't want to come here because of crime, poverty, and so on, and homelessness. And I never thought anything about it because no one messes with me when I come here. I don't know what it is. I guess it's because of my size and my color that they leave me alone, because I go to the gas stations. And in fact, I started when I first got here. I got my hair cut at what's the name of the barber shop? But anyway, my barber was in South Dallas, and so I didn't think anything about the neighborhood. I was learning or hearing this is obviously, and it has become prime property in the city. But my son and my wife said, no, we're not letting you do that. And so I gave it up. But watching the newspapers and looking at some of the offers in terms of building homes here in South Dallas, and there was a lot on Pennsylvania, the $142,000 they built. It was empty, but they would build to suit. And I said, let's do this. Pennsylvania, I said, since I'm coming over to the museum all the time, it'd be perfect. But they would not let me do it. I said, I'll put up a fence and now a burglar alarm system that would be second to none, and we'd be safe. We just did a film about the history of the museum when it was built, and so we moved from we moved from Bishop College, which is about 10 miles south of here, to Fair Park in 1987. We were in the visitors building, Magnolia Lounge. We just basically had an office and we had no space to really do anything. So we started raising money to build our current building, which opened in November 1993. We, again, given all this history, we broke ground in 1991, and the grass grew back over it. I always like to tell that story because it's just sort of funny that we broke the ground and nothing happened. The grass grew back over the spot. Anyway, in the film, Dr. Robinson talks about how once we had got all that money together and with all the planning, we needed a spot in Fair Park. So we chose this spot over here where the museum is now. Well, the director of the music hall, the leader of Friends of Fair Park didn't want us there. Basically, the thinking was we didn't deserve to be there because we're not the type of people who would attend the music hall, okay? And of course, what type of people are we talking about? Okay, anyway, Dr. Robinson goes on to say in his testimony that Yvonne Ewell, who's also on the park board, and who eventually would be assistant superintendent with school board, gets up and reads them. You know what I mean by read, right? Okay, just lays them out. So much so that even the people who had opposed us moving to that spot voted for it. So it was a heck of a story. I wish I could have been there to hear what she said, to literally turn everybody around so that the vote was unanimous to have the museum in that spot after she spoke about it and embarrassed them, talking about they're not the type of people who would come to the music hall. And of course, the director then was concerned about parking space. He didn't want us to take this parking space, from the music hall. And as you know, we still fight on Saturdays and Thursdays through Saturdays and Sundays for parking space, but that's okay. Anyway, I worked with Robert Edison, and we did the Juanita Craft Home. We finished it in 1993. We started September of '92. Tried to turn it into a historic home. We went out and found some of her belongings. The city had put them in a warehouse, and we wanted it to reflect who she was. As I said, we basically wanted it to say what this particular plaque says about I had no children, so I adopted the world. We wanted to show how she worked with Amicia Smith, Walter White, Thurgood Marshall, and the legend is that even President Lyndon Johnson came to her house, in South Dallas, which is something that should be noted. And so we tried to put all of that in the house in terms of her involvement with the Civil Rights Movement, her protesting at having the NAACP Youth Council, protesting at the Texas State Fair. She had people like Diane Ragsdale, who was part of the NAACP Youth Council, protesting at the theaters downtown and literally developing this sort of cadre of leaders who came on the scene, particularly in the 1980s. And so she was very special. I never met her. My colleague, Robert Edison, knew her, used to transport her from place to place. And so he sort of gave us this sort of link to her to really tell her story and her impact on South Dallas, and of course, on the city of Dallas. I've written an essay about her. It's called Juanita Craft, and another unsung hero of the Civil Rights Movement. I start with a story about how she won the Lenz Award in 1969. And of course, the Lenz Award goes to the person in Dallas who's done the most service during the past year. And so, of course, I said in my essay starting out that this Lindsay really didn't mean a whole lot to Juanita Craft, but she's been doing service all of her life. One of the stories that Julia Scott Reed wrote, I guess it was in 1970, 1970, was how Juanita Craft, and A. Smith, George Allen, had been working for 30 years to provide African Americans access to political power in the city of Dallas. She quoted Juanita Craft as saying, it was sad in 1970 that we couldn't get out more than 40% of the African Americans in the community to vote. Then, of course, one of the things I say in my articles, though, is she was elected to the city council in 1973. On the city council, though, she was a conservative, because some of you may know there was this push to increase African American participation in the city council and voting in the city and so on, but she voted against expanding the city council to provide more Mexican and African American participation. And it sort of threw everybody that she was on the other side with sort of the white businessmen from North Dallas who wanted to limit African American participation on the city council. But anyway, we did her justice. As you said, they reopened the House. So if they changed it completely from how we did it in 1993, but that's okay. We wanted to see it grow and develop into something special because she deserves it for her long history of service to this city.